understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How you doing there? It is time for the podcast. John and I are exchanging creaking necks, bad backs, bad knees, stories,
ankles.
the whole thing. But the lovely thing is, this week we are back in the HQ after what seems like years on the road.
Yes.
Years.
You've grown real tall.
John came in this morning. God, look how big you've got. God almighty. So we've just got a little pencil and I'm standing up against the wall there. And we're saying, David in March. David in nearly June. But no, it's great to be back.
It is good to be back.
It is good to be back. And we might have to go out for a celebratory scoop.
We might.
After this. And I was actually, John, do you know where I was last night? I was in St. Anne's Park in Raheny.
Oh, yeah.
Watching Inhaler.
Oh, yeah.
Lucy's Mates band play. And it's just brilliant to see a young band. I first saw them in the Workman's Club when there were 50 people at it.
Yeah.
And they probably played to 10,000 last night. Supported by Blossom's Manchester band, kind of indie pop band.
Right, yeah.
And then a really good Dublin band called the Gurriers, you might have heard of.
Right.
Great night though. Really, really interesting night. Balmy Dublin evening.
But they've kind of grown and developed and evolved since the Workman's, I'm sure.
Completely. It's just lovely to see, four young fellas who started out in school together. And of course, because I've known them since they were little boys, little kids. And they're now out in front of 10,000 people rocking the stage. It's really great to see. It's great to see. Of course, the alphas are at the back, It's like,
sound of the suburbs.
Well, actually, it's funny you mentioned the sound of the suburbs, John, because we are obviously in book week now.
We are. I'm surrounded by books here in the HQ.
Well, in the HQ, I'll tell you what. Well, the reason is the paperback of Money has just come out in the UK and in Ireland. It'll be out in shops in about 2 weeks' time. And it looks fantastic.
Yeah,
I think it looks gorgeous. It looks gorgeous. And it's full of all those nice quotes. Not the not nice quotes. We didn't put them up, the nice quotes in there. And we also have the first look at the American edition, John.
It's totally different. When I saw that first, I thought the first thing that came into my head is A Brief History of Time by
Stephen Hawking.
It has that bang about it.
It has a physics bang about it. But again, it's just it's the American audience.
Yeah.
It's a totally different
Looks
look.
good.
So
it's a black cover, by the way.
It's a black cover. It's a little bit science fiction-y looking. I think it looks good. It's not out till November in the States, and that'll be another trip. We have to go. We have to go another trip there, John. But it's interesting you talk about the suburbs, because I have always believed that there is a great intellectual conceit on the part of particularly critics and commentators that suggests that great art, great music, great creativity needs to either come from some sort of gritty, earthy, impoverished artist in the garret notion idea, sort of turn of the century idea, kind of almost like Brendan Behan, you have to be of the working man to create authentic work. Or like Yeats, you have to go down to find the Celtic mysticism in the West Coast, and you have to be an Inish man, and nothing can possibly come out of the suburbs, places that you and I came from, right? And the shorthand has been for years and years. These snobs, in effect, have always said, that nothing comes out of the suburbs are boring, they're 9 to 5, they're mundane, they're derivative. And then you look at all the great writing and all the great music.
I've always...
And great poetry comes out of the suburbs.
I've always thought that creativity lives in the suburbs.
Well, I think...
And maybe it's driven by the kind of the dullness and the boring. So people are... the way you allow kids to get bored, so they tap into their own creativity.
In their little heads, yeah.
And maybe the suburbs is a little bit like that.
This podcast, by the way, dear listener, will not be on just the suburbs, but it'll be on the combination of the suburbanization of culture, number one, but also the education of the suburbs. Because we're going to talk, it's going to be quite Ireland focused today, which is fair enough because we've been all over the shop, right? Might as well come home, right? And it's going to talk about some fascinating data on just how educated Irish people have become, which I think is exceptionally interesting. But it comes back to something I wrote years ago, a book called The Pope's Children.
Yes.
which was a great book. First book, sold well.
It was a great book, if I may say so myself.
No. It was a great book. It was.
Many people say.
Many people say no, but it was great fun writing it because it's your first book and you have a whole host of ideas in your head that just come out onto the page. But it was, in a sense, a celebration of suburbia, right? And it was my little kickback at the notion, the sort of pop sociology notion that the suburbs are dull.
Yeah.
And I always think, like, obviously, ideas come from inside people's heads. And when people are thrown together in suburbia, what you get is you get all these people from the country. Like if you look at the estate we were brought up in, people from the country, people from the city, people on the way up, people on the way down, people in different circumstances, people reinventing themselves, people coming from small places in the countryside, acquiring really swanky accents in 2 minutes, like telephone voices, all that sort of stuff. But, people trying to reinvent themselves, reimagine who they are, rethink their future in a way. And that's what the suburbs is. It's this sort of cauldron of self-advancement.
Yeah.
And snobs find that really, really annoying because the suburbs have got self-improvement written on their sleeve.
Well, Mac, all you have to do is look at some of the bands that we grew up with. The Jam are a great example of that. They're
Woking.
Woking Mites.
Yeah.
Most of the best bands came from the suburbs.
Exactly.
The grunge movement came from the suburbs.
From the suburbs. Yeah. And where does heavy metal come from? Nuneaton, West Brom, the West Midlands, the suburbs,
Yeah.
And I mean, this is what I think is the Beatles are from the suburbs, right? All of them are from the suburbs. So this idea, in actual fact, in celebration of the suburbs, John, at the book festival in 2 weeks' time at Dalkey, we have this. I think you will love this event. It's called The Sound of the Suburbs. It's not actually the sound. It's the creativity of the suburbs, right? We have Roddy Doyle, probably Ireland's finest, most consistent writer, documentarian, the man who speaks Dublinese, but who also created an amazing suburban world in Barrytown.
Yeah.
So you have Roddy Doyle, with our friend from The Specials, another band from the suburbs, right? Horace Panter, Robert Shrimsley, maybe one of the best political commentators in the UK, but also a great humorist, another child of the suburbs, and Northern Ireland's Wendy Erskine, who writes about the suburbs of Belfast, right?
Right, okay.
And the idea is, and I'm really looking forward to this event because what I want to listen to is the creativity of the average person. It's called the 3-bed semi-detached creativity, right?
Yeah.
Where that comes from, where the urge is, on our road, Marion Keyes, another from the suburbs person writing about the suburbs, right? And again, if you do English literature or English criticism or literary criticism courses or sort of sociology of language and sort of literature, you'll find this notion that nothing good comes from the suburbs. But in actual fact, everything comes from the suburbs.
Where did that come from? The notion of that come from?
I think it comes from a turn of the century snobbery. Turn of the last century, where you have a combination of sort of superannuated Marxism, which identifies a heroic proletariat, and only from the heroic proletariat can great wellsprings of creativity come from. That's just, makey-uppy shite. Anybody who actually... No, it's makey-uppy shite.
Yeah.
It's only people with bachelor's degrees can come up with that sort of stuff, right?
Yeah.
People who've never experienced working in a factory.
Yeah.
To make it heroic and fantastic, right? So I think it's kind of second-rate Marxism came up with that idea. And then, of course, there was always, and there is always, a snobbery amongst certain hyper-elite gangs. I mean, I kind of witnessed it once or twice. I've been doing sort of book festivals, particularly over in the UK, and it's very, very elitist over there. So it's that combination that gangs up on the suburbs and doesn't realize that, again, creativity has to come from where the majority of the people live.
Well, where life is.
Where life is, exactly.
Yeah.
And life comes from the suburbs.
But it's interesting you should say, you mentioned people with bachelor's degrees.
Yes.
Now, there was a one of those visual capitalist charts that I saw last week that put Ireland as the most educated people. And they were basically measuring the number of people with bachelor's degrees.
Yeah.
And it was over 50%, the highest in the world.
So this is an amazing story, John. And this is the story we're going to focus on this particular podcast because it's very easy to be down on Ireland we tend to be very hypercritical. We can tend to look at ourselves and see all the evident problems. But one of the most extraordinary stories is the transformation of this country from an education perspective. So in the last 25 years, there has been a massive expansion of third level educated people. So people with bachelor's degrees, people with masters, etc. So much so that Ireland is now the most educated population in the world.
Yeah.
So 54% of the entire working population has a bachelor's degree. That puts us quite far ahead of the second place, which is Singapore and Switzerland, which are in the late 40s.
Yeah.
So
I always thought it would be somewhere like South Korea.
Yeah, so did I, but no, they're catching up. But
Yeah.
they do very well on is individual scores of young children.
Right. Yeah,
In mathematics and literacy and all that sort of stuff. But as a general rule, what we have seen is, and this comes again as part of the suburbanization, what we've seen is a massive middle class bourgeoisization of this country largely through the education system. And we have seen a surge in what you would call the middle class, the educated class. And that, of course, has changed the society dramatically in ways that it's probably still too early to say how it's going to pan out. That's the first thing. But there was a really also maybe even more consequential piece of data this week from the OECD, which was looking at the following. It was looking at the amount of kids from poor backgrounds who drop out of university. Right.
Yeah.
So not just the amount of kids who get into university, which is still something we should work on. But when they get into university, the amount of kids who drop out, kids from poor backgrounds, versus the amount of kids from rich backgrounds who drop out. And more specifically, it was the amount of kids, clever, hard-working kids from working class and poorer backgrounds who drop out, vis-a-vis lazy, underperforming rich kids who tend to stay in college, right?
Lazy.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
Yeah, I think it's fair. Yeah, lazy. Let's call them lazy, right? It's the slovenly rich kids versus the hard-working, industrial, Stakhanovite poor kids. But in general, this just so the point was, what we see all over the world is that underperforming rich kids finish university in much greater numbers than outperforming poor kids. Now that's interesting. And the reasons outperforming poor kids tend to drop out in higher numbers because they don't have an income from their parents to keep them going. Because they're learning from their mates are earning good money elsewhere. And they're thinking, God, I can get, 800-900 quid a week doing something else. Why could I be arsed, right? They don't see, or they've no role models to tell them the value of staying around. And when the economy's booming, they tend to say, I'll take a job now.
Yeah.
So what you see in most countries is that even kids who get into universities from poor backgrounds, who are already overachieving, because it's harder to get in. We'll talk about that in a second. It's called kitchen sink capital, which I'll talk to you about in a second.
Yes,
right?
do.
Even those kids drop out more. But in Ireland, that has been reversed. So overachieving poor kids are dropping out less than underachieving rich kids.
And
this
why
is really
is that?
interesting. We don't really know. And I don't want to overstate one data point.
Yeah.
But taken together with the overall re-education of the population, what we might be seeing, and if we are seeing, it's really going to be significant for the way this country operates in the future. What we might be seeing is a gradual but relentless advancement of younger, poorer kids through the education system. And if that is the case, we do know one thing, John, from all development economics, is that the fastest and, more importantly, the most permanent route out of poverty is education. Right?
I thought it was MMA.
MMA, if you can smack the head off somebody, okay, but it's education.
But I've a bunch of questions on this, because absolutely it should be celebrated. But first of all, is this an advertisement for free education?
Completely.
Yeah.
For free education. Also, we got on specifically for a significant increase in, do you remember the weirdest person in our school, in any school when we were kids, was the career guidance teacher?
They were useless.
who told me I should be a diplomat. I'm the least diplomatic person in the world. I remember I went.
He was a diplomat.
I know. I remember your man says to me, your man looks at me, he says, oh, you're quite good at languages and you seem to be interested in the world. You could become a diplomat. At which case I slapped him around.
We will be in all sorts of
imagine
conflicts
Irish
around the
foreign
world.
policy. Exactly.
Ireland's name would be mud.
It's not like conflict resolution. It would be conflict ignition. To ignite conflicts wherever you go.
But come here to me. The other thing that you mentioned there was kitchen table capitalism. Capitalism?
Capital. So this is a really interesting idea. So basically what this idea is about is that middle-class kids acquire what they call kitchen table capital in the United States. And basically that's what they learn around their kitchen table. And why is that different for poorer kids? So what you have is aspirations, middle-class aspirations, attachment to education, networks that their family or their friends bring them into.
Hugely important.
We used to call it pull in the old days in Ireland, right? It's the same idea. It's just a little bit more dressed up. It's called networks now. Also the role models they have, an older brother, an older sister, or a mate who's gone on to do, let's say, medicine or whatever. And so that sort of assumed capital, it's kind of absorbed by osmosis in middle-class kids and upper-class kids, where they expect to be in these industries, not because they've got huge expectation, but because that's what they've been brought up to think of themselves as.
But it's a playbook, isn't it?
It's a playbook,
You're given the playbook by just...
And you're given options. And you're given choices. And the most important thing is you can do it because people have done it before you.
Yeah.
So you take a working class kid whose parents are working, if let's say they're together, but they've never either finished school, or if they finished school, they've just finished secondary school. Everybody around them is working.
Yeah.
Nobody is in education. Everybody's taking home a wage. Everyone's also going out and spending a wage. So they've actually got their, they're having fun. Yeah. They're having good fun. So the difference with those kids is they have a different form of social capital when they get to the age of 17 or 18.
Yeah.
The middle class kids.
Yeah.
So that theory is very persuasive because it kind of makes sense. It makes common sense. And what that's saying to you is then upward social mobility is very gradual. It happens very, very slowly. Mm-hmm. And I think that's also the truth. It does happen slowly. But as long as it's going in the right direction, this is a good thing. So as a result of that, working class kids, even if they get into college, are more likely to drop out because they don't have the infrastructure, the social, the kitchen table capital. Yeah. Whereas richer kids will say, look, I'll stick with this for a while. That's the first thing. The second thing then is what we've argued before in the podcast about difference between poor people and rich people in terms of time horizons.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, yeah.
And again, I forgive me if I'm repeating this, but it's basically rich people think in years and poor people think in minutes. And that's a really interesting way to frame it.
The here and now versus, being able to plan.
Exactly. So there's an expression called poverty obliterates the future, which is a really good expression because it encapsulates this idea that the future is a never, never land that is a luxury for certain people and not all people. Mm. And the never, never land is the planned land. So it's the place that you go in your imagination where you say, this is the type of person I imagine myself to be in 10 or 5 years' time. Now, as a result of that, I will then invest in myself today to become that person. Now, what will I do? I'll get a job or I'll get a degree or I'll read or whatever. I'll invest in myself. Now, for middle-class people, that seemed logical. In fact, that's what many, many people's mothers would have said to them. Go to college now because you get reward in the future. But for poorer people, right, that is a luxury that many poor people don't have. Because again, I come back, rich people think in years, poor people think in minutes. And the reason that poor people think in minutes is because they are strapped for cash. And if you're strapped for cash, you're worried about paying the bills today.
Yeah.
So there's a blizzard of financial requirements that hit a poor person in their wallet every single day. Mm. And they cannot see beyond that. So therefore, the idea that you can imagine yourself in 5 or 10 years' time and plan accordingly is something that is not available to poorer people.
Yeah.
And something that is available to rich people. So, and again, it's a bizarre thing to say, but rich people live in the future. Poor people, as you say, live in the here and now. And how that translates into education again is the idea that if the course is a pain in the arse and you're not enjoying it, a poor person will say, fuck it, I'll take a job.
Yeah.
And then what we do know is that in longitudinal American studies, which are very, very interesting, because the Americans have been taking data for many, many years, much longer than we have, what you see is children, university graduates get paid substantially better than non-university graduates over the course of their lives, number one.
Yeah.
But number two, which is very interesting, is that people who fall behind in their 20s, wage-wise, never catch up.
Why is that?
This is because, and this is it's your sense of yourself. It's a lot of things. One, and this I think the most interesting thing, is to do with your perception of your own worth, which is something very intrinsic in people. And we forget about that.
Are you saying that that's set in your early 20s?
Yeah, and you undersell yourself. And this is a really interesting sociological and maybe psychological idea, that if your 20s, which are a highly competitive decade for most people, and I can see it with our children, your children, it's very, very confusing. It's very hard to get a grip. It's very hard to get a stake. It's very hard to get a start, all those. But what you see in the United States in these longitudinal studies is the kids or the young adults who find their 20s very, very confusing and fail to sort of what they call launch in their 20s, pay a generational price. So by the time they're in their 40s, they're getting paid less than the people who did well in their 20s. Even if they have slightly caught up, they get paid less. And many people think it's because they settle for less, because a type of...
Even if they're at the same level in a job.
Let's say, so you're...
kind of middle manager.
Let's say you're both sound engineers.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
Just take your business, right? They're both sound engineers. But what happens is the people who have acquired status and money earlier have a certain amount of self-confidence that they overprice themselves.
Yeah.
And, it's the kind of...
Until they get found out.
Until they get found out. I was doing a speech the other day and I was explaining how the city of London, what I remember in England, was just full of Irish lads quaking in their boots, waiting to be found out because we'd bullshitted so much at interviews. Whereas the English lads would be much more inclined to say, no, I can't do that.
Yeah.
In the interview, the Irish, well, of course, I've done loads of times. And then just say it.
You start getting worried. You start looking at middle management and going, like, how did you get there?
Oh, I know. Well, I've also had that conversation as well. We had that with Joe Haslam the other day about the public service or something. But so let's come back to the education. So there's lots going on, but what is fascinating and something I think we should celebrate, and we don't celebrate it half enough, is this broad acquisition of third level education in Ireland, which puts us on a totally different trajectory to other countries, because other countries' politics now is being driven by the left behinds. And the left behinds, as Donald Trump said, I love the uneducated. Remember that?
Yeah.
And now maybe even the Trump's attack on elite universities in America, all of them, right?
Yeah.
The attack on the education system. I mean, could this be a cynical ploy to create generations of uneducated people who will vote for generations for MAGA?
Yeah.
But that idea that, if you take the basic idea that education is a propulsion force out of poverty everywhere in the world, right? That anything that advances the educational agenda has to be good for society.
Let's dig into this a little bit because, like I said, it's a number and a stat to be celebrated. But under the surface, we have 54% of people with bachelor's degrees.
Yeah.
But we also have a severe lack of tradespeople that are necessary to build our houses for these clever people in the suburbs. We need people to build the suburbs.
I think you need both, and I think that an education system. So, one thing that interests me is, for example, the German or the Dutch education system, which has a variety of options for all sorts of intellectual and practical capabilities of kids, right?
Yeah.
And there's no doubt of that. In fact, the Dutch are the country on the top of the list where poor kids do best in university vis-a-vis rich kids. And one of the reasons is, and it's interesting, career guidance, we mentioned is that Dutch invest a lot in what they would call career guidance for young kids. So they spend a lot of time asking 12, 13, 14, 15-year-old kids, what do you want to do? And guiding them around the place.
Yeah.
And that's one way. The second is they don't have a leaving cert type system. So you can go to university and do whatever you want, but they fail you very significantly in university if you're not good enough.
So loads of people go and do first year and then the dropout rate
is very, very high.
Enormous,
it's very, very high, but that's the Dutch system. They say, look, you can do whatever you want.
Yeah, I think Belgium is pretty
similar. But you've got to be actually at a serious standard.
Yeah.
The German system has embedded in the apprentices.
Yeah.
So German industry and the apprentice system is creating the tradesmen, the mechanics, the technicians that the Germans need for their industry.
Yeah, I had a conversation with the guy. I used to work in London for an organisation called ETB.
We worked about once a week, a day a week. Mooched around.
Yeah, I always avoided the rush hour as well. But it was ETB, Engineering Technology Board. But he was explaining to me the German education system, as you just said, the apprenticeship. And he was saying it's all about appropriate education in the appropriate location. So, for instance, Wolfsburg, where the main
cars,
the main Volkswagen, all of the technical colleges and all the schools are gearing their students to work for Volkswagen, and it has worked really well until recently.
Until Volkswagen stopped making cars.
Yes, exactly. And they're being taken over by Chinese cars and Tesla and all the rest.
Which is why they're going to make tanks.
Is that what's going to happen?
They're going to make tanks. Yes. As I said before, I'm not sure the idea of heavily armed Germans in the center of Europe is a good idea as a general rule, but that's what they're going to do.
But it's that idea of, that was a great system to a point, and then all these things change.
All these things change, but what I think is critical is that if you take the view that education gives you options, gives you choices, then the better educated the workforce, the more likely that workforce is to be very flexible and very adaptable and kind of get up and go, kind of self-confident. It comes back to this idea of self-confidence. I'm not saying that the Irish system is amazing, but what I want to say is we might be going through the second phase of an educational transformation, John, that has been evident in the last 50 years in Ireland, which has changed the country. The first phase was free second level education introduced in 1967 only, which is amazing.
Yeah.
And now we are going through the third level phase. And if we look back at what the second level free education did to transform the country, it might give us a blueprint to see where the country is going.
Well, let's have a talk about that after a bit of this.
Fair enough.
So this phase 3, Mark, that you're talking about, or phase 3 of our national education, which kicked off in 67. But what exactly, just explain to me again, what exactly happened in 67 and why was that such a big watershed?
Well, I tell you, I know, John, that camogie is close to your heart.
It is indeed.
And I know there has been, again, I've been away and I haven't been following the skort drama.
Oh my God, you should kick that off in our house.
It's the difference between skirts and shorts, is it? Give me very briefly what's been happening.
Well,
by the way, listener, this is deep Irish culture.
They always wore skirts, and then
the girls,
young girls to wear skirts.
What are skirts?
Which is a skirt with a
shorts inside.
Shorts inside, and all of the camogie players in the country were saying, "We want to wear shorts; they're more comfortable." And honestly, I didn't see the big deal of it, but this was a ruling that happened years ago, and then it came up again recently, and they ruled against it. Then there was all sorts of protests, like Dublin and Kilkenny. They all came on in shorts, and then they all walked off because they were told to go and change.
Right, so it's real. So it's real old school Irish.
Anyway, it's all done.
It's all
done and dusted. They held an extraordinary meeting or whatever it is, and they just went, "This is ridiculous."
And end of story.
End of story.
But It focuses on something that I want to talk about, the social transformation through the level of education, right? Which is the following. Camogie is and has been exploding in the suburbs of Dublin, of Cork, etc., in a way it hadn't been 40 years ago or 30 years ago. Okay, it's obviously it's not a new game, but its popularity is new.
Yeah.
So the question is, why is that? Right? Now, there's many, many reasons. One is the GAA themselves and the kids themselves and the infrastructure. But where does the infrastructure come from? Why is the infrastructure of the GAA so professional, so all-embracing, so threatening to other sports, other sports would argue, and frankly, better at getting organized? And I think we have an idea here, John, and we've talked about it before. But in 1967, free education comes in. So the two sectors of Irish population who were most excluded from the education service were poor small farmers, who were the poor people in the countryside, and the urban poor, not just in Dublin, but all over the small urban centres around Ireland. So those people were excluded. So the education system was the preserve of the very small middle class, right? And we know that when education expands, the middle class expands because educated people have what we call middle class aspirations, right? So whether you like it or not, and lots of people shout and roar and say it's awful, it is what it is, right? So the question then is, who benefited most from free education in the 1960s and 1970s and 1980s, and where did they end up? Where did they go? And there's an amazing piece of research written in the 90s by two UCG sociologists called Damien Hannon and Patrick Cummins. And they found something amazing. So Cummins and Hannon, what they did is they went and they looked at every county in Ireland to see who benefited most. And what they found is the counties in Ireland that benefited most from free second level education, i.e. the social uplift, right? It wasn't to do with whether those people had money. It wasn't to do with whether those people had access to other income. It wasn't to do with the professional class, et cetera, et cetera. It wasn't to do even with investment in education. It wasn't even to do with the number of schools, the quality of the schools, the ratios of pupils to teachers, all those things you'd think. The single biggest, most crucial leading indicator for whether counties were successful in education was the amount of small farmers.
Oh, explain that.
So small farmers, people with very small holdings, right? So what happened was, and this is a complete outlier in the world, right? Because in England, when they introduced free education after the Second World War, it was the industrial working class that benefited most. So your Brian Ferries, your Brian Enos, your John Lennons, all going to art college, they would never have done that. The sort of 60s creativity of England stemmed from there. In Ireland, the suburbs. Exactly, the suburbs. In Ireland, it came from small farmers. And this, again, was fascinating because what it seemed to prove was that it was basically Irish mammies in the countryside figured out that A, agriculture was on the decline. B, their bigger families couldn't sustain more than one son on the land. And C, the only alternative to Irish kids in the 50s was emigration. By the time the late 60s comes around, the mothers had figured out, get your education. So the sons and daughters of small farmers all over Ireland did exceptionally well as a result of free second level education. In contrast, John, I'll just give you a statistic, right? Compared with the industrial working class, the urban working class, right? 30% more children of small farmers did the Leaving Cert than working class kids, and 50% more small farmers' kids went on to university in the 1980s.
Right.
So
and the upshot of that was?
The upshot of that is that those people became the professional class. And they moved to the suburbs. We're back to our suburbs. So they moved from the countryside, wherever they were, to the suburbs of Dublin in the main, and all around Galway and Cork and whatever. But they may have come from the land and left the land, but they brought their culture with them. And their culture was GAA. And that is the reason that we now have a massive importation of deep GAA culture into South Dublin and North Dublin, but particularly South Dublin,
Yeah.
suburban estates that never had them when we were kids.
Yeah.
Right? Because when we were kids, we never played them. So the people who lived in our estate were different to the people who lived in the newer estates. And the major reason is the people who lived in the newer estates, like 20 years after us, were people from the country. And the people from the country, because they did really well in second level in the 1970s, they moved to Dublin in the 1980s, they moved into estates in the 1990s, and it's their kids now are playing camogie.
Yes.
And that's how the whole... So what I love about this is that education isn't just about if you do well in college or if you do well in your leaving cert. It's actually about how it changes the society. So the legacy of the second level transformation is the Scort campaign in this year, right? Because it's the second generation.
Yeah. So what's this third phase then that you mentioned?
Well, this is the really interesting question. Who is going to benefit, right? So if we now know that more young Irish people are in college than almost any other country, right? We don't know exactly where they're from, but the likelihood is they're from more typically poorer backgrounds than they were a generation ago.
Yeah.
Right? Those kids are not dropping out. They're finishing college. They have access programs which need to be enhanced dramatically, I think, because as I said, education is the quickest path out of poverty.
Yeah.
And it's the quickest path into giving more opportunity. Also, an educated society typically is a much more stable society. An educated society is a much more equal society. We see that on the Gini coefficient, which is basically the coefficient that you look at to see whether societies are equal or not. Ireland has a Gini coefficient of about 2.7, which means that we're around the European average of inequality, stroke equality. The more educated we become, the better that is for us. The more people will have aspirations, the more people will actually be in the middle.
Yeah.
This is the assumption.
Yeah.
So what is interesting, it means that Ireland will become a highly educated service economy because these people are educated for services. And this, I think, is something that you're worried about.
Yes, it is, because, I mean, you mentioned there about, the influx of more rural students into cities in
like 20 years ago.
20 years ago. So that was a kind of a brain drain from rural communities to urban societies. But we also have the brain drain of our these 54% of people who are completing university education with their bachelor's degree. They're looking around and going, okay, so I could probably get a job here, but I can't get a house. And they're being forced out. So we're educating these people for the world.
Yeah, we are. And
that's okay if they come back.
Well, A, it's okay if they come back, but B, it is a massive drain on the exchequer because it costs a lot to educate people.
Yeah.
And if you spend, some calculations done in Eastern and Central Europe suggest that bringing a person from kindergarten all the way to elite university probably costs the guts of $1 million to the state in education, teacher salaries, in education bills, in books, in training, in the buildings themselves, the heating, all that sort of stuff, right? So if you're losing 50 or 60,000 of them a year, they're going to Australia.
Yeah.
You're losing, and the Australians are benefiting for free. And this is always the great argument in immigration. That is, if immigrants are of a higher educational quality than the locals, then it's a net positive to the country because somebody else has paid for the education and you get it. So you've raised a fascinating point, John, which is about what is the point of this in an economy that can't give them housing, give them a standard of living, all that sort of stuff. And that, I think, will be the subject of our next podcast on Ireland, John, which will be on, is this economy overheating? And if it is the mass emigration of young people a sign of that? That, as you said, what you're saying to them is, yes, you have degrees, but you know what? You're going to live in a box room with your mum and dad in your 20s, mindful of what I was saying about people going backwards in their 20s. And they're saying, okay, I'm out of here. So our next podcast, John, on Ireland, we may well do one between that on my next travel, which is to the Baltics.
Yes.
But our next podcast on Ireland will be on whether Ireland is overheating or not, and whether or not the significant emigration of young, educated Irish people is an example of overheating. And we have to actually take some steam out of the economy. But that's for next time.